if they don't have enough people to work on mainframe systems, from the perspective of development and also from the perspective of operation, um, that would be bad, because now they're getting past a point where they don't have the manpower to do to do any further conversion either. They have tried many times. I think the DMV had tried at least once, didn't succeed, and I think they're very cautious about trying that again. So this is going to be, I think it's going to be interesting how it's all going to play out. I mean,
Is there any
yeah.
prerequisites for the assembler class that you teach?
I don't teach assembly language in using the IBM mainframe assembly language anymore. Um, but when I did, it was an entry level class. It had no prerequisites, which was also very strange because assembly language programming is supposed to be kind of more or less a capstone class. It's one of the last class that my students take before they graduate and transfer to CSU or UC somewhere.
Isn't that the language that's really old, or is that a newer one?
So the assembly language is still relevant, but most people don't write. They don't write programs, in assembly language. Very few people would do that, especially with a mainframe system like the Z architecture, because the Z architecture has a very rich instruction set, which basically means there are so many hundreds, possibly up to thousands of instructions. It's really not easy for a human being, a person, um, to remember all of those available instructions and choose the right one. And low-level programming, is also very extremely time-consuming. So it's not really practical to write jobs or apps, using assembly language. All right, so it is time to get started. In fact, it has been 8 minutes since past that time. So what we'll be focusing on today is network security, because last time we started to talk about networking, and I thought, well, we have to talk about security. That's part of the schedule. And as I said, I'm not very well versed in IBM mainframe computers or the operation thereof. However, I do have a lot of general background knowledge in terms of networking and security. So I'm just going to bring in IBM related topics whenever it is relevant. But otherwise, I will first be introducing the basic concepts of networking and security. So I hope that is okay with you guys.
Yep.
Okay, all right, cool. So let's go ahead and get started with these topics. Particularly, we'll start with thinking about things from the perspective of a hacker, from someone who's trying to break into an information system. So obviously, there are reasons, right? What would motivate a person to break into an information system? There are usually a few. Okay, there are the disgruntled employees. Okay, we'll start with those people who really just want to break in because they're angry with their employer and they want the employer to suffer loss, because of their anger. That accounts for a very small percentage of break-ins, and it's I don't think it's very significant in terms of percentage. But employees also can do the most damage because they understand the system and they're the quote unquote insiders. But we are not here to stop. This is generally speaking. There are certain things that can help with protecting a system from disgruntled employees who are still employed and who are still working. But for the most part, we are talking about criminals. Okay, we're talking about people who want to break into a system for financial gain. So how many ways can you gain? How can you financially gain by breaking into an information system? Something like the DMV mainframe, or the franchise tax board mainframe, or the Wells Fargo Bank mainframe. So I'll let you guys think about this a little bit and tell me what you think are potentially, ways people can get money, okay, from breaking into a system.
Selling personal data.
Selling personal data. So you basically gain you download, okay, all the personal data. So we know that DMV probably has a lot of personal data, right? Because you have the driver's license database, storing all kinds of personal data. But most of those, I'm not sure. I don't think the DMV keeps track of credit card numbers because that's through a vendor. So breaking into the DMV, mainframe computer may not be able to do that. But you can still sell personal data like social security number or driver's license number. So that's worth money. Yep, that's one.
Well, social, you can create a new identity, you can open bank accounts,
Mm-hmm.
you can authorize information at financial institutions by
Yep.
calling and spoofing.
Yep.
Uh, uh, there's all kinds of things. You turn around and use what you want to do and sell it on a secondhand market for people to subscribe to. There's all kinds of ways.
Yep. Okay, let's try to think a little bigger. I'm not trying to train you guys to become criminals, but you have to understand the criminals in order to understand how you can defend a system. So, are there ways to make money even if you cannot get the data out of a server, to the outside world?
Ransom.
Ransomware, exactly. So ransomware is on today's topics as well, okay? Because that's an increasing trend of how people make money. They don't really, steal your data. They don't copy your data. In fact, they can care less. They cannot care less about what your data is about, okay? They just know that your data is worth something to you, okay?
They encrypt it.
They just encrypt it and they hide the key and go like, well, until you deposit this much money into a Swiss account or Bitcoin into this Bitcoin account, you will never see your data again. And I have some interesting personal story to tell you about this. It's not firsthand; it's secondhand. Okay, someone whom I know has a recent experience with ransomware. So when we get to that point, we can talk about it. What about anything else? Is there another way to make money by quote unquote hacking a information system? And this one relates to botnets.
The what? Botnets?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep,
Oh,
bot as in robot, B-O-T,
what is
bot.
a botnet? What is that?
Botnet
Oh,
is when you slave a bunch of computers without generally without other people knowing about it, but you gain control and access to it. You could perform DDoS attacks, which is basically flooding the network so that like a website or computer servers crash, that type of thing. But yeah, the one of the I listened to a podcast about it. There's actually a website that I'll try and find real quick. Where in the early days of the internet, someone decided that they wanted to map the internet to see how many connections were out there, and and in the process, they created a map of how the internet works. They also found out that there were multiple upon multiple, like millions, of computers that were still not protected. They were still on factory settings, so their uh, user ID was admin, their password was admin, or admin nothing, or root, and so forth. And they were able to use, because it took so much time for their computers to reach out to test ports on other computers. They actually created a botnet by finding open computers. If they had one computer, they could only do so fast, but if you had 30 computers, you could do it 30 times faster. Well, this person ended up creating one of the first botnets, and from that point forward, they can use it.
yep. So basically, a botnet these days, typically refer to a malicious, with a network of computers, that were broken into, and whoever did this has a malicious intent. So the idea is, we don't really care about grandma's computer. There's probably nothing really of any use on that computer, but we're going to use grandma's computer to help launch what we call a DDoS attack. DOS itself stands for denial of service. So DDoS stands for distributed denial of service attack. So a hacker, depending on the infection ability and also how widespread it is, can potentially control multiple millions of computers worldwide through the infection. And by controlling all of these computers, millions of computers, and they basically point all of these computers to a particular website, let's say Wells Fargo, okay? They can basically cause a problem of congesting traffic so badly or overwhelming the web interface so badly that Wells Fargo cannot serve their regular customers anymore. So this is called the denial of service attack, DOS attack. And it's also a DDoS in this case because you're distributed across millions of computers. If it's only one computer generating all the packets and all the requests, not a big deal, okay? Because you can just tell a router to stop the traffic from that particular IP address and, it's done. But if you have millions of computers, they are coming from different regions of the world, they're coming from different IP addresses, so it becomes much more difficult to fend off a DDoS attack. So the idea is it's kind of like ransomware in a way. You're basically, asking these financial institutions to go like, well, I don't know about you. If you want your customers to be able to access your services again, once again, transfer this much money into my Bitcoin account or transfer this much money into this particular Swiss account, and then we'll call off the DDoS attack. So it's the same kind of idea, except in this case, it is done using networking technology, and it does not even involve having to break into a system in order to encrypt anything on that system. So that's DDoS. All right, so we are now starting to understand, the mentality of a criminal hacker. Um, there are also hackers who break into a system to disable certain things very specifically. Um, I cannot remember the name of that one. Can anyone remember the name of the virus that infected some Iranian nuclear plants? Stuxnet. That's it. Stuxnet. So we'll take a quick look, not because you guys are running a um, nuclear plant or anything like that, but it is interesting to know about this one. So Stuxnet is an interesting malicious computer worm. So there's a difference between a worm versus a virus. A worm is active as opposed to a virus is passive. So a worm, once it infects a system, it will actively seek out other computers on the network and try to infect the other computers as well. A virus, on the other hand, does not do that. A virus, needs to be quote unquote invited in by clicking on a particular email, going to a particular web page, double clicking on an executable or something like that. So anyway, this particular worm has a very specialized payload. So once it infects a Windows system, it proceeds to look for what we call a CAN. It looks for other nodes on a CAN, CAN, which stands for Controller Area Network. And on a CAN, you don't find regular computers. You find your controller units. So those controller units in this specific case were used to control a centrifuge in a nuclear plant, because you need those in order to refine uranium or maybe plutonium. I cannot remember which one, but you need those centrifuge to refine radioactive elements so that they become weapon grade radioactive elements. So the centrifuge has an interesting mechanical characteristic, being they have to spin at a very high speed, and you don't want to change that speed very often because that will actually increase tear and wear very significantly. So the virus, or the worm, I should say, the worm has a payload to change the programming on those individual controllers on the factory floor to speed up and slow down the centrifuge, but in a way that is undetectable. So the centrifuge, basically all, had premature tear and wear, and they went out of commission, way before the anticipated lifespan of the centrifuge. So you might say, oh, what is the big deal? A centrifuge is just something that turns really fast. Just go buy new ones. Not the kind that you use to refine radioactive elements, apparently. So that basically disabled this particular country's ability to produce refined radioactive elements for weapon use. So that's Stuxnet. Okay, you guys can look it up and read the rest, on your own. The reason why I brought up Stuxnet is because there are some people, hopefully not too many, who would think mainframe computers are kind of like, controller units on a nuclear plant floor. Who would know about something like this, and who would want to attack a system like that? And the answer is a lot, because a lot of people understand that American Express uses IBM mainframe computers. Wells Fargo Bank uses mainframe computers as a backend. So as a result, there's actually a lot of useful information and data being stored on these mainframe computers. In other words, there's a lot of stuff that is worth money. Now, what about those organizations that that they use mainframe computers, but the data is actually only useful to the company itself, not really that useful to the public? Well, if you can break in, you can still use the ransomware approach, encrypt all the data, and then you just demand money before you release the key, because otherwise the company would not have access to the data anymore. So those are the popular or common criminal intents, when someone is trying to break into a system. So we are now going back to here. So when someone is going to launch a network attack on a computer, typically they don't want to do it on site, okay? Simply because well, there are many reasons you don't want to do a network attack on site, because the hacker will be exposed. Okay, security cameras may catch that person. There are a few other things, where it is not practical. Someone can be coming from a different country. There are also maps of cyber security or cyber attacks, in the world, and some of those are real time too. You can look those up and just kind of get an understanding of how big of a problem cybersecurity has become. So if you look up cyber attack real time map, that should be a whole lot. Okay, so I'm just gonna look at this one here. And it's the nice thing is it's animated. So these are happening in real time. They're not recorded. They're not like, oh, this is what we saw last year. No, this is real time. And you can see, how, the attacks, launch. So Korea, Thailand, Saudi Arabia, and the United States is usually where the attacks land on. And this is, I think it's very interesting, because it basically shows you that systems that are exposed to the internet, they are constantly under attack. Okay, there's no such thing as, yeah, the system got attacked last month. No, we are talking about how many times per minute. So what do hackers do? Okay, when they try to attack a system? The first thing they do is they would usually do what we call a port scanning. Now they have to first to get the IP address, but IP address is very easy to get. Okay, it is not intended as a secret to begin with, because when you enter a name like dmv.gov, okay, so I'm gonna go to dmv.ca. Oh, typo. dmv.ca.gov. Press the enter key, and then we are now at the website of the DMV. So what we see on the URL, the bar on your browser, is really just the domain name. Now you can translate the domain name into an IP address. I'm using Linux here. There are equivalent commands in just about any operating system. So mine is called dig, D-I-G, and you just have to enter the domain name, which is dmv.ca.gov. Press the enter key, and now we know the IP address of the DMV website. Okay, so now that you have a IP address, hackers will do what we call a port scan. So the port scan, okay, let me close the tabs that are not, that I don't need. Okay, I'm going to close all of these. And close that one. This one is from last class on Monday. Okay, so a port scan allows the hacker to assess which port is open. So what exactly is a port? Okay, I want you guys to tell me what a port is because we talked about this on Monday. Okay,
Is
first,
it the port what's attached to the back of the computer, which is like the telephone line? No?
nope, this is not a hardware feature, it is a software feature. A port is a concept of the transport layer, which is layer 3 of the TCP/IP stack. So once you have so the IP address is like a physical address of a government building. Okay, so you're located at da 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 da, and that's the physical address of a government building. A port is it's kind of like a number that identifies a service of the government agency at that particular address. So port 80 is something that most people know about because port 80 is usually associated with HTTP, which stands for Hypertext Transport Protocol. Fancy name, okay? All it is a way for your web browser to talk to a web server so that you can, browse the web, you can, send queries, you can ask for information, you can shop online, and so on. But port 80 is not what most people use. We use port 443 because 443 is the port number of HTTPS, or secure HTTP. We'll talk about secure protocol versus insecure protocol later on. But essentially each port, okay, which is basically a number from 1 all the way up to 65,535, that specific number identifies a service at a particular IP address. So now we can say, oh, so that means at a particular IP address, we can offer a number of services, and that is entirely true. Okay, so another example in here is port 50,000. Okay, port 50,000 is corresponding to the service that we know as DB2. So I think many of your agencies make use of DB2. So one way to make a connection to DB2, or the primary method to make a connection to DB2 as a server, is to connect to port 50,000 of the IP address corresponding to that particular server. So are we okay so far, in terms of the concept of what a port is in networking terminology? It's a software concept, it's an abstract concept. It allows a single IP address to support a number of services. And each service is associated with a particular number, and there are standardized port numbers. So for those of you who want to kind of get into this a little bit more, you can look up port numbers, and here's a quick table of the common port numbers. So there are some of these are more well known than others. Telnet is one that is more well known. So Telnet is 23 right there. So Telnet is 23. FTP, or File Transport Protocol, is 21. SSH is what I typically use to connect to a Linux or Unix server, and that's port 22. SMTP is also a very important protocol. It is simple mail transport protocol. This is how email gets sent. It is at port 25, and the list kind of goes on and on and on. You can see how there are 143 pages to this. So basically, it's just a table lookup. Okay, you give me the number, I'll tell you what it is. Okay.
Is this standardized through
Yeah,
everywhere?
it is pretty much standardized. So there are certain ports that are not standardized, like port 8000, okay, or port 8080. So those are not typically reserved for anything, but a lot of web services would actually use those high number ports for specific purposes. But typically for something that has an assigned number, they don't usually move it around. So I can go back to port 25 for SMTP. So most email servers would not change SMTP to another number. So they're basically kind of stuck with this number. So port scan, okay, getting back to port scan. Port scan is the first step. Basically, you know an IP address, and then you do a port scan. And what a port scan does is it will identify which ports are open. In other words, oh, okay, I see this server is listening to this particular port. Port 80 is being listened to. Or I can see port 443 is being listened to, because you want to identify all of the ports that are being listened to, because that will help prepare you for the second stage. Okay. The second stage is to identify what type of program is surfacing those open ports. So you can basically find out what version of that server program this company is working on. Now this one is kind of relevant. It's kind of important for especially government agencies or larger organizations, because everything has vulnerabilities. Okay, no, if someone is trying to sell you a particular program and go like, oh, this database program is rock solid and it doesn't have bugs, it has no security concerns and whatnot, it simply cannot be true. Okay, it simply cannot be true. It is only a matter of how many vulnerabilities and how many are already discovered. Okay, because the rest are simply just around but not discovered yet. So how does that relate to a hacker trying to get into a system? So a lot of responsible vendors would patch, okay, they will fix the vulnerabilities as soon as possible. And there are plenty of agencies, research organizations, universities, and whatnot, also antivirus companies and whatnot. They are actively trying to find existing vulnerabilities of various types of components on computers. And when they find something, they're gonna contact the vendor and go like, hey, we found that your software blah 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 version blah 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 can be hacked into using this approach blah blah blah. Okay, so they would actually tell the vendor about it before they publish it. Okay, so the vendor now has time to fix the bug, to patch the system, and then they can release the new version of the software, and at the same time also publish the vulnerability on the web. Okay, and you can find this type of information just by Google searching. Okay, so you can go to Google and you just search for vulnerability or improve, and it's just name whatever you want to do. Okay, so we can look at Oracle, okay, as the database engine, and here we go. Okay, that's just the update. There we go. So we have a list here, and you can see how they score in terms of severity, and they will also list how what type of vulnerability it is about. Can it be done remotely? Can it only be done locally? What is the complexity, and so on? And if you click on a particular link, it will tell you everything that you need to know about this security risk. But usually by the time the vulnerability is published, it means it's already fixed. Okay, so typically they will also include a version number that says it only affects these particular versions and it is now patched. Okay, so that sounds good, right? Responsible vendors, and IBM is definitely one of the responsible vendors, and they would do whatever it takes to patch these security holes. So the problem is not the vendor. Okay, the problem is not the vendor not fixing the problem. The problem is how soon a patch is going to be installed. Okay, that is the problem. So, well, we know a patch can fix a particular vulnerability issue. That's good. However, sometimes a patch can also unintentionally cause backward compatibility issues. So that depends a lot on the revision control practice of the vendor. If the vendor is sloppy about that sort of thing, they might be incorporating a new feature into the patch of an older version of the program, and therefore causing incompatibility issues, and it can be problematic. Okay, you may be fixing one problem in terms of security, but then your software doesn't work as expected anymore because it's basically fundamentally a different program. So a lot of large organizations would use test servers and have their own internal quality assurance to processes to test a patch on the test server before it is applied to a production system. So, okay, I'll give you an example. Let's just say the DB2, IBM sent the cybersecurity people of your section, or I think with CDT they definitely are going to have people who specialize in computer security. So they will subscribe to all of these, emails and other ways of getting notified when a vulnerability is discovered and a patch is released. So they know about that stuff pretty much as soon as possible. But they cannot deploy the patch right away. Okay, not because IBM is refusing to release and say, oh, this is the new version of DB2 and we fixed that problem. Okay, that's not the problem. IBM will tell you, okay, we got to fix. But you don't want to integrate the new version into a production system because sometimes it can cause issues. So what people usually do, or what most large organization would do, is they would have a test server to basically run about the same scripts using the same kind of database, perhaps a smaller version of the database, but they will also run all kinds of tests on that system. So when you have a patched DB2, they would install a patched DB2 on the test system, run through all the scripts, run through all the jobs and whatnot, make sure that everything still works. Okay, before they roll out the patched DB2 onto a production system. So that doesn't sound too hard, right? Well, it is hard when the frequency of vulnerability discovery is high. Okay, because these days, okay, let me ask you this question. Um, how often does Windows update itself?
Every Tuesday.
At least every Tuesday, because Tuesday is called Patch Tuesday, but sometimes they also release more critical patches between Tuesdays. And how long does it take for a patch to apply on Tuesdays?
Overnight.
I'll give you an example. Sometimes my students will be taking a test, and they will say they cannot take a test on a particular day because the system is still rebooting. Because certain patches take a long time. It depends on how fast your system is. If you have a hard drive instead of a solid state uh,
Device.
solid state drive. That's it. Thank you. So instead of having a hard drive, you have a SSD. It can take a long time for Windows to patch itself, depending on how many things it's trying to patch. And sometimes after the patch, something doesn't work anymore. That has happened. Okay, I'm not making this up. Okay, some of you may even have experienced these problems. So you don't want that to happen with the DMV. You don't want it to happen with the Franchise Tax Board. You don't want this to happen with Wells Fargo. So that's why a lot of these organizations would go through a very thorough and long process to test a patch before it is rolled out. So meanwhile, the vulnerability is already published on the web. So the hackers know about the problem, they know which version it affects, and they probably also have tools to exploit that vulnerability. So you have a window of time before you can apply the patch because it's still being tested, and after the release of the publication of the vulnerability on the web, that hackers have that window of time to break into a system. Okay, so it's an issue. Okay, so this is an issue that every organization has to deal with. Any questions about this portion?
No.
I'll show you one little thing here. I know this is Linux and it's not 100% relevant to what you guys are doing. So I'm gonna become a system administrator here, and I'm going to do a port scan on my own system. And of course, I cannot remember how to do that. And let's see if I can find the command. I know it starts with an N.
NS lookup?
Hmm? No, NAS lookup, just look up something. It's not a security issue. Nope, it's not there. Okay, I'm just gonna cheat and use Google. So just type. I'll put it into the search bar so you guys can see too. Linux port scan. All right, so there's a specific program to do port scan.
Nmap.
Nmap, that's it.
I just saw it.
Oh, okay. You guys have fast eyes. So Nmap, okay, and it's not installed yet. Okay, I'm gonna get it installed. Oops, no, typo. It may not be its own package. I think it may be inside another package. Nope, it's its own package. All right, so we'll get it installed. This is why I like to use a distribution. And Red Hat is a distribution too. By the way, we mentioned Red Hat on the class on Monday. All right, so we can do an nmap, and it has all kinds of options too. So I'll just go ahead and scan the local host, and right away it tells me what ports are open. It's telling me SSH is open, SMTP is open, IPP is open, and Kerberos 524 is open. Microsoft DS, I think that's a domain server, is open. Because I do open up my computer so that my wife's Windows machine can share files with me. So that's what that is for. So there are ports open. And a hacker can then try to make a connection to these ports to find out what version of a server it is using. So one way to do it, let me see if I can still remember how to do this. I'll find out how Telnet works, because you can tell Telnet what port number you want to connect to. So I can say Telnet localhost port 22. So this is SSH. So I want to go there to find out what version SSH is using. So right away, I can now tell that I'm using SSH 2.0, which is based on OpenSSH 8.4. My computer is a Debian system using version 5. I can tell all of that stuff right away just by running that command. I'm not going to do this on a on the internet, okay? Because port scanning can be detected, and when someone detects that it's being port scanned by an IP address, depending on what that target website is, it can cause severe consequences. So I'm not going to do a port scan on something that I do not own in my own household. Okay. But this is what hackers do. Okay, hackers will do a port scan, identify what ports are open, and then they will go through those things and find out what version of software is being used at those ports. I'll do another one just so that you can get an idea. So this time I'm going to go to SMTP, the Simple Mail Transport Protocol, and right away I know what program is handling SMTP, what version it's using. And this is just the current time, which is not terribly it's not a security risk, but the hacker would be able to tell all of this stuff here. So if this particular version of XSIM has a security problem and my computer is actually exposed to the internet, the hacker can now use that piece of information to find out how to exploit the vulnerability of this version of XSIM. All right, so that's kind of, it gives you an idea. Okay, it gives you an idea of what hackers do in order to launch. Before they launch an attack, they basically try to assess or case the computer first. All right, and most hackers do not directly attack a server, and instead they would try to hack into an employee personal computer in the agency first. That's because a lot of mainframe computers are sitting inside an intranet, and as an intranet, it has specific firewall appliances to isolate it from the internet. So a hacker on the internet cannot directly launch an attack to a resource that is sitting behind a firewall, inside an intranet instead of the internet. Okay. So that's why, okay, hackers will, specifically target people inside an agency, inside an organization, inside a corporation, to see if they can first break into those personal computers, possibly belonging to even not the high-level employees. Okay, they will start with the low-level employees first, simply because there are more of them. Okay, that's one reason. So now, how do we attack so that's usually done using phishing. So some of the hackers will target specific messages to an organization. They will try to spoof and go like, oh, by the way, we are a contracted financial service company for Los Rios. Okay, so they would target Los Rios employees by a message that seems to be legitimate for Los Rios employees. Okay, and and then if I click on that link, there's a potential that link will bring me to a website where the website would install something on the browser or on the computer, and then they will basically they will try to hack into my system by tricking me into clicking on a link in an email. Okay, so this type of stuff does happen. I have a story, the second-hand story about ransomware earlier. That also ties into this attack vector because they believe that one of the receptionists of that company opened up an email and clicked on a link, which started the whole thing. So yeah, so it does happen. Do we have any questions, any comments at this point about computer security up to this point? All right, nothing so far. All right, so next question: how do you attack a personal computer? Even if the personal computer is inside a secure intranet, what type of things can infect a personal computer? Now we know executables are bad ideas, right? If somebody sends you an executable, don't click on it, because when an executable runs, okay, it can potentially access everything, almost everything in your system. So definitely a bad idea to open up an executable. A zip file can contain an executable, so don't click on that either. What else? What else do you think can infect a computer?
A mail attachment.
And mail attachment of any kind, photographs, JPEGs, GIFs, PNGs, even though those are formats for pictures and photographs, they can also potentially have virus payload. Do you guys know that?
I didn't know that about JPEGs, but
Yep. So that's interesting because if somebody posts a JPEG on eBay, okay, that can get a lot of clicks, right? And when that picture is loaded, it doesn't even have to be saved, okay? When that picture is opened on a computer, that can potentially trigger the virus, to become active and infect that system. So it depends on the vulnerability, but it can be that simple. Just by going to a certain website, not even a questionable website. This is just eBay or Facebook or even LinkedIn, okay? And a computer can be infected just by loading and viewing a picture. Okay, a photograph, of someone on LinkedIn can potentially, okay, I'm not saying that's happening right now, but it can potentially do that. All right, next up is SQL injection attack.
The
Yeah,
photographs, real quick.
yeah,
I think a lot of your more reputable places scrub those photos before they actually allow them to be posted. I believe Facebook just recently started doing that themselves,
yep,
like within the last few months. But up to that point in time, you could go on a picture, and if you knew how to pull metadata from it, you could find location and types of things where pictures were taken, um, the unit it was taken on, and so forth.
So it depends on what they're scrubbing, out of the picture, because the payload may not be in the metadata.
Right. No, that's what I mean. Is that that's what I'm saying? Is one metadata is one thing that they were allowing people to go through, but recently they've started scrubbing everything out of it so that to before pictures up, and it was only just recently, like within the past few months.
Wow. Okay.
You know.
So I'm hoping other sites like LinkedIn are doing the same thing, because I can see how Facebook is actually blocked from a lot of workplaces. So it's not an issue because people simply cannot get to the Facebook website. But LinkedIn, on the other hand, is sort of work related. Um, so so that's the other part that is kind of interesting. Okay, well, thank you
We
for
we
that
had
info. Yeah, go ahead.
we had LinkedIn actually blocked at work for a time when I was in collections. They blocked it, and we had to like kind of petition for them to reopen it up because it was an asset for us to find where people were working and stuff like that.
Exactly. Yep. That is interesting. That is interesting. So now we're getting to SQL injection attack on web front ends. Okay, and most organizations have some kind of a web front end these days, and most have a web front end that is quote unquote interactive. In other words, when you go to the DMV, web front end, you can do a lot of stuff, right? You can pay for your registration fees, you can schedule for an appointment, and so on and so forth. On the IRS web front end, you can probably go through some API to turn in your tax forms and whatnot. So so now the question is, what exactly is SQL injection? Okay, so the first part is SQL. We talked about SQL when we talked about data organization, because it relates to a relational database, right? So DB2, Oracle, MySQL, MariaDB, and so on, they all understand SQL, which stands for a structured query language. Okay, so it's basically just a querying language to talk to a database to retrieve information. A web script, okay, which is basically a program that runs on a web server. So its job is to, on one hand, it will look at the HTTP request, particularly the parameters. So if it's a GET or a POST request, you can send in also parameters, which basically identifies what you want the website to do for you. So it would interpret that and then it would have a back-end access to the database, retrieve the relevant information, and then it would format all that information, possibly including pictures, and use diagrams, tables, and whatnot, and then it will render everything into an HTML document. HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language, so it will format everything into HTML document, and then that becomes the reply to your HTTP request on the browser. Then when the browser gets the HTML document, it will render on the screen, so everything looks nice and useful on your screen inside Firefox or Chrome or whatever browser you want to use. So that's under a normal situation. So what hackers do is they look at the format of the HTTP request and then they ask, I wonder what kind of bad coding practice may be used in the web script, because there are very well known bad practices with those web scripts, and certain ones would allow they would allow a query to quote unquote break out, to access more from the database than what it is supposed to. So there are people who can launch SQL injection query attack on a particular web front end to get all kinds of information back. So now that you know the term, all it takes is a Google search to find examples of successful SQL injection attacks from the past. So you just look up SQL injection attack, and I suppose example is good, or you can look for cases from the past, real life attacks and code example, and this is from Security News. So you can do this on your own, okay? But the bottom line is this is one particular attack vector where they don't need to break into a system. All they need is to have a educated guess of what type of problematic scripts may be written, and just test one after another one, and sometimes they find the jackpot. Sometimes they break into a site, or they break into a database by SQL injection. Other times, if the web scripts are well written, they understand, and it may not be doable, okay? But there are scripts out there that can launch this kind of attack automatically. So it's not like somebody has to be sitting on the computer to try different methods. It's all done using scripts. So the last one is ransomware. So finally I get to talk about the second-hand story that I have heard from someone whom I know. So in this case, I believe the company, well, I'm not going to talk about what the company does, but it was attacked by ransomware, and whoever was attacking the system was not just a script, okay? There was actually a person behind it, because they went and encrypted all the backup copies, all the online backups of the database. And unfortunately, the company also did not hear the consultant's advice to perform off-site backup, to back up their data onto a tape, and then take the tape offline, and then put it into a safe, somewhere. They did not do that. So as a result, the company almost lost all of their information. Now that kind of information, I know the company, the nature of the company. So the data that they lost is not something that contains personal information. You cannot sell that information. It's worth nothing to anything but the company itself. But ransomware doesn't care, right? The whole concept behind ransomware is it is worth money to the company itself, okay? And I have just encrypted everything. You cannot get back to it. So, so in the end, the guy that I know, he actually found a backup copy of the database that the hacker did not find. So that way they were able to recover the database from about a month ago, which is better than nothing, absolutely better than nothing. So that was their story, and this is not even a big company. Okay, it wasn't even a big company. It wasn't a government agency. It wasn't the military branch. And it happens to everyone. It happens to any organization that has. If the hacker thinks the company has the money to pay for the ransom, they can potentially be a target. So there is that. And I have just recently heard about a story of a large organization paying the ransom. I think it was electricity. I think it was a power grid thing.
Yes.
It was
Pipeline.
pipeline. That's it. There we go. So does the rest
I
of the
heard, I
okay?
heard, I heard, I think it was today that they've been hit again.
That is
I thought I heard something about that earlier, that the same pipeline was something else was hit.
was it this one?
Yeah, it was.
Colonial Pipeline.
Yeah,
This
but
was.
I heard it was 5 million, not 90 million.
Yeah, I heard 5 as well.
And it was Dark Side was the one that did it, but I heard 5 million. See, and CNBC, they're like fake news because it was 5 million, not 90.
I guess they did not quite specify, currency of which country.
It was Bitcoin.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, it's
Bit-
90 millions worth in Bitcoin, but they did not say, US dollars versus, some other currencies of other countries.
I heard 5 million in Bitcoin.
Ah. Well, you guys can do some.
It's right down there.
Oh, wait.
I just saw it. It said right there, 5.3 million worth.
Oh, okay. So this is US.
Oh, that's
Wait.
saying that they're dark side. Yeah, yeah. It just says that their Bitcoin only had 5.3 million in it.
Before its funds were drained. And the hacker received 90 million, and then it said right here that the wallet contained 5.3 million worth of the digital currency before its funds were drained. But they were paid 90 because right here it says DarkSide received $90 million worth of Bitcoin. Well, it's still a big chunk of money.
Yeah, New York Times says 5 million.
Okay.
Yeah. So anyway, they received a lot of money.
Yes. Yep. And I'm not really sure about government agencies, what policy they're going to use, if they were hit by a ransomware attack. It's almost too terrible to think about, but that's exactly the reason why someone has to think about it, right? Because what if it happens? All right. So section 2. Okay, let's take a break, or not. I mean, I'm good with just keep going. Do you guys want to take a break or not? All right.
Hello,
Yeah.
anyone?
I'm good.
I'm fine either way.
Okay. Well, then let's keep going. All right. So section 2 talks about how to basically stop those attacks, or at least mitigate. If you do get hit by these things, what can you do about it? The first one is firewall. I'm pretty sure all of you have heard about firewall, because sometimes when you install a particular program in Windows and you start it up, and you get a security warning of, hey, Windows firewall is detecting that this program wants to access the internet. Do you want to let it do you want to allow the program to access the internet? So that's basically what a firewall does. Okay, or one of the very many things that a firewall would do is to control traffic. So it monitors and it controls network traffic. And even most basic configuration of a firewall is to block ports from accepting incoming connections by default from the outside. So you can say you can tell by default a firewall would basically it would have two sides. It would have the outside and the inside, and it would basically block every single request to make connections from the outside, and therefore by default it's going to protect everything that is sitting behind the firewall from active attacks from the outside. So that sounds pretty good, right? It sounds like, wow, that should basically stop everything. It doesn't quite stop everything because phishing doesn't, it's not something, it's not an attack from the outside. It's more like a Trojan horse, where, the hackers will entice people to click on a link or open up an attachment. That is a Trojan horse approach. And as a result, a firewall cannot really do much about that. So a firewall is going to stop a lot of things. It does stop port scanning, and it also, basically it will stop direct access to critical system services. In most organizations, port 50,000 of DB2 really should be blocked from being open to the internet. So there are many ports that really should be blocked from the internet. In your situation, with IBM mainframe computers, being able to connect using the 3270 terminal, that connection should also be blocked from the internet. Is that true?
I don't know.
Can you connect from home using a regular computer? Open up an ISPF session.
No.
If
No.
I use my personal computer to open a mainframe,
I
and
had
that's
to remote in to my desk at work
Uh
in
huh.
order to
That
sign
makes
in.
sense. Having to remote in
okay.
means. But Jennifer said that you were able to connect from home, right?
Right, but I didn't realize I'm doing remotely. I'm doing a remote access using
Are you using VPN?
sometimes I do,
Okay.
sometimes I don't, but there's another one I forgot the name of it. Uh,
Um, Citrix.
no, I have to look. Sorry.
They just created a portal that we could go to now
hmm
that we don't have to use Citrix, but I haven't tried it.
Do you know how the portal works? What type of technology is behind it?
I have no idea. All I know is it's a portal that we go to the portal
Uh huh.
on the CDT I
Yeah.
guess their page, and we're supposed to be able to log in to our desktops through the portal
Oh, okay.
instead of using Citrix.
Okay. So it allows you to access your laptop at work, and then on your laptop at work, you can open up a 3270 connection.
Yes.
Okay, but you cannot open a 3270 connection directly from your home computer.
No.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, I just because that is like super dangerous. Okay, opening up the TOS TSO front end the TSO port to the internet almost almost suicidal when we are talking about government servers. Now, if you go through the IBM Master the Mainframe series, those servers are accessible from any computer because those are not really important servers. They're very small instances, and they only contain educational data sets for students to practice on. So those are kind of like a special case where oh, we don't really need top of the end type of security because they want everybody to be able to participate in the activities. But other than that, okay, in any type of real organization, using mainframe computers, the 3270 ports really should not be open to the internet. All right, moving on. Um, Note that a firewall can be a software feature, of the very same system that is being protected. So the term firewall is not referring to a hardware or a software. It is referring to a mechanism. So the mechanism is rule-based. Okay, so basically you can specify certain rules. The rules can be based on the source IP address, the destination IP address. It can be based on the port number. It can be based on time of day and so on and so forth, in order to determine whether a connection should be allowed or not. So it can be a specialized hardware component that is implementing all of these rules, but it can also be on the very same system that is quote unquote being protected. So if it is on the same system that is being protected, it really should only be used as a secondary safety feature and not as a primary safety feature. Because if network traffic can actually end up on the system being protected, then there's a potential that the system itself has a vulnerability so the hackers can bypass the software firewall to get into essential parts of the system. So that should only be used as a secondary safety net and not as a primary safety feature. So the primary safety feature really should be a hardware box that is independent and also stand alone from the other systems that it's trying to protect. And as far as I know, IBM does not make hardware firewalls. Does Can anyone confirm one way or another?
I cannot.
I don't think so. I think most companies use Cisco, Cisco products, for as networking appliances. Now, having this all said in mind, um, most organizations have some ports that are still open. Port 443 is HTTP or secure HTTP. It's HTTPS or secure HTTP. I misspoke a little earlier. Um, that is usually open because if you want to be quote unquote open for business, you need to let that port to be open. So that's kind of one thing that really it's kind of important because it's still available on all systems. A firewall can also monitor and control traffic going out of an organization. This is useful when someone is trying to steal data. For instance, if somebody has access to a database that has social security numbers and trying to transfer that data out of the server to someplace else on the internet, then potentially a firewall can detect that in the traffic there are patterns that look like social security numbers and decide to stop that transfer from inside out. So some firewalls can have rules to specify that. Um, but I have to tell you, this approach is not effective in reality because most of the time, the same hacker would use SSH or some other secure protocol to transfer the sensitive data out of the server. And once things are encrypted, the firewall would have no idea of what content is inside the the encryption. So as a result, the ability to inspect the content of traffic going outside of an organization is usually useless. Because hackers know that they have to encrypt data first before transmitting that data out of the server.
So a funny story that just happened to me recently
Go ahead.
was I was trying to send a Word document outside of our agency, and I was trying to send it to one of my instructors at ARC, and it had a password lock on it because I always locked it because it was my resume.
Uh-huh.
And I couldn't, she wasn't receiving it. And so finally she received it, but then when she sent it back to me, I never got any of the emails. Well, come to find out, I called the help desk,
Mm-hmm.
and that whenever a document is unable to be scanned because of a password, they don't allow the document to
Oh,
come into the system. So they had to release it once I told them what it was
that's
because
interesting.
if it had a password lock on it.
That's interesting. So, okay, so okay, it's interesting in several ways because what I can immediately think of is what if it is not a Word document anymore? In other words, what if you have another way of encrypting the file into something that the system cannot it just cannot recognize what it is? Would it also block that, or would it only block
I,
something that it can recognize and it is encrypted?
they have some type of scanning system where they scan whatever's coming in or going out.
Mm-hmm.
I know that much, but
So,
because it
okay,
had a password on it, it wouldn't allow it
that is interesting. Oh, yeah. Curious minds just wants to know.
because they couldn't scan it because it was a password lock on it.
Okay, so here, okay, so what if you just type in a text file, just a whole bunch of gibberish that means absolutely nothing to anyone, and use it as an attachment?
I don't know. I've never tried it.
Because, okay, I mentioned this because there are many standardized programs that can take a binary file, byte stream, and turn it into, base 64 is one. There are many other formats. So it can basically reformat a file into a text file with just your regular text. Um, but it really contains the original data, and then the other end just has to use a program to convert it back into the original file. And I'm just wondering, what if the system cannot find out what the byte stream means? It's not a doc file, it is not a docx file, it is not an XLS file, it is not any one of the file formats that the system understands, and it has a .txt extension, and it does only have ASCII characters in it. In other words, it's a legitimate text file. Would it still look at that and go like, this looks like gibberish, but it can be encrypted content and then re-encoded in somehow. Maybe I should not let it pass, the firewall also. I'm just curious because,
I have no idea.
okay, okay. It's out of the scope of this class, but as soon as I heard about what you said about the mechanism, I just, naturally, have all of these questions in my mind because I guess, in my mind, I always wants to know how things work.
Right.
Okay, that's cool. Thank you for sharing. All right. So IBM, so this is this relates to IBM terminology. The SAF, which is System Authorization Facility, can link ZOS user management to network traffic control. So this is kind of neat because now IBM inside an intranet, ZOS can use this information, so it knows if something is coming from a particular IP address, it is associated with a particular user ID. And then it can use that information regardless of what that traffic is. It can use that information to basically determine what to do with that traffic. So it adds one ZOS specific level to firewalling because now it can associate an IP address with a server with a user on ZOS. So I think this part is worth mentioning because it's one of the few unique things you can do on the ZOS in addition to normal firewall things that you can do. Section 2.2 is on IDS, which stands for Intrusion Detection System. There's also IPS, which stands for Intrusion Prevention System. So IDS and IPS are interesting trends in network security concepts. So a firewall is not exactly a IDS. Sometimes Some firewalls, also claim that they can do IDS. So it depends on, what people qualify as IDS. But a firewall, technically speaking, is basically just running a bunch of rules to limit and control traffic. It's like, okay, if this packet here or if this connection meets these requirements, we're going to block it. Okay, or you can also turn it around and say if it meets these requirements, we'll let it in. So it depends on whether you're looking at it from the blacklist perspective of what to exclude, or you're looking at it from the whitelist perspective of what you can allow to get past the firewall. So IDS is a little bit different. So IDS typically, there are two ways to look at it. But the IDS that I'm familiar with is assuming a hacker is or has already assumed the identity of someone who is legitimately authorized, and then it would use AI and statistical mechanisms to find out whether something suspicious is going on. So this can be something that's very simple. It can be just tracking the IP address from which a user signs in, and it can go all the way to access pattern using a user interface. So I'll give you an example. Okay, if you have ever watched someone else, accessing ISPF or use TSO to interact with ZOS, you might find out that everyone has a kind of different pattern of doing things. Okay, the timing can be different. The way they specify an option can be different. So there's a certain pattern that a system can recognize. It can do a statistical analysis to find out. Okay, somebody just did this access. Does this access is it closer to person A's access pattern, or is it closer to person B's access pattern? There are mechanical, mathematical ways to do that. So when someone says IDS, this is what I think about. Okay, it's the intrusion has already occurred. Okay, somebody has already signed into the system as somebody else. The question is, can you detect it? And therefore the term intrusion detection. Okay, it has already happened. We just want to know. We just want to know. How quickly can we find out that somebody has logged in? The other type of things that a system can potentially watch out for is, okay, Lupe just signed in using the user ID of Lupe. Somebody signed in with the user ID of Lupe. But in the past 16 months, okay, the system says Lupe has only accessed this particular part of the menu twice. Okay, and 99% of the time, these are the things that Lupe would usually access. On this particular day, on the other hand, these 5 other features that Lupe has never accessed before, Lupe is hitting those things, like 70% of the time. That is intrusion detection. Okay, you're basically looking at things that a user normally would access over time, and then you're noticing a different access pattern, and it's out of the ordinary. That is intrusion detection. So intrusion detection is never 100%. It is entirely possible that Lupe just was taking a class, and the class is instructing Lupe to go to certain menus and experiment with certain things, and Lupe was just practicing. That's entirely possible. So intrusion detection does not end up with usually it does not end up with a hard consequence. Typically, it would alert someone who's live, monitoring the system, and go like, hey, you might want to take a look at this. Okay, see if it is something that is suspicious. Okay, so it would be a live person, who will then be looking back at the log. Okay, we talk about logging, next right here. So it'll be someone going through the log of what Lupe has been doing, and that person, may actually know Lupe personally. Go like, oh yeah, I know Lupe has been taking this class, and that's exactly what he's supposed to do. Not a problem. Okay, it's entirely possible. But at the same time, it can also be someone who go through the log and go like, no, this is really suspicious. Okay, the time, this is not the usual time that Lupe would be working. Okay, and this access pattern is clearly indicating that somebody is trying to get into something that's sensitive. Then that person can go into, find out what IP address is associated with the potential intrusion, and find out that it is not even in Lupe's cubicle. Okay, well, where is it? It's located at this part of the building, over there. Send security guard over because nobody's supposed to be over there right now. So that's what intrusion detection is to me. Any questions? Sounds like science fiction, right? Sounds like some of those cyberpunk, sci-fi movies. All right. Well, I did read up, a lot of documents as much as I could, today because yesterday I was too busy making the final exam questions for one of my classes. But I did read up a lot of books and articles today. ZOS does have IDS, and it is applicable to 3270 sessions. However, it is not ISPF or TSO aware. So the IDS is really looking into the packets, the network packets, and not really looking at the content and not associating the access pattern with a particular user. So, in other words, I think IDS within ZOS still has room for improvement. Potentially not as an IBM product. It can be a separate vendor. Kind of building a subsystem that can do um, an improved version of IDS. Any questions? Okay, all right. So we're moving on to logging. Logging is one of the things that you can do with RACF. I suppose you can call it RACF, Resource Access Control Facility. So basically, it allows a person to watch the log in real time, and if not, after the fact, they can go back to the log to find out, what happened in the system if they suspect anything has happened. The log can also be processed after the fact by a script, by a program. So that script can, after the fact, find things that are suspicious, like in the previous day. So obviously, this is not real-time IDS, nor is it firewall, but it is still useful because if it's better to know that something might have happened rather than not knowing it at all. So having the log available to be analyzed on the following day, it's still better than not having the log available at all. All right. So section 2.4 talks about signing and encryption. So not a whole lot of stuff here that is specific to ZOS. ZOS has all of these standard features already implemented into the system. But I do want to talk about the concepts a little bit. Unless you guys tell me that we have taken networking classes already and we know all of this stuff already. Is that the
No,
case?
we had a class on networking,
Mm-hmm.
and through our mainframe university,
Mm-hmm.
and it made absolutely no sense to me at all whatsoever when the guy was teaching it. He was just like all over the place, and he was all into it, and I had no clue what he was talking about on all the different ports and the networking and stuff.
Well, I can be doing exactly the same thing too.
No, you did a better job explaining it than what he did, but I mean, he was pretty intense
Okay.
talking about it,
I see.
about networking, and yeah.
Okay, well, in that case, I'm going to get into the paragraph, sentence by sentence. So there are different terms, okay? Because a lot of people, understand, oh, we can sign a document like a PDF, digitally, and there's also encryption, okay? So there are two different concepts they try to achieve two different objectives, even though they are based on the same technology. So they are related because they use the same technology, but in terms of their purposes, the purposes are different. So we'll talk about signing first. Okay, a digital signature is a way to establish authentication. I'll give you an example. So let's just say that you receive an email, okay, and somebody said, I am your, you know, uncle blah blah blah, okay, and I would like to give you this much money. Come meet me up at this place, and I'm gonna give you the cash, okay. Well, that's certainly suspicious unless you have an uncle like that, okay. I certainly don't. So that would be suspicious. But just for the sake of, well, maybe I'll entertain this idea. Maybe I'll just bring a bunch of friends with me to ensure my safety and go to that place. But I would still want to find out, okay, did my uncle send that email or was it somebody else? If the email was signed with a certificate that you can verify, then you can know one thing for sure, okay? Whoever sent that email had that certificate. Now, does that mean that your uncle actually sent the email? No, because somebody could be using the computer that your uncle is using and use that certificate to sign that particular email message. That's entirely possible, but the only thing you can confirm is whoever sent that email had access to a certificate. Okay, we'll talk about certificates down here somewhere. Okay, but the bottom line is signing. Digital signature is one way to establish authentication. Okay, can I know, whoever claimed to have approval of this, form, or whoever authored this document was in fact the person that the author claims to be. That's signing. And then encryption is a mechanism to ensure privacy. Okay, if I send something, to another person, how do I make sure that only the recipient can get to the content of that document? Okay, so that's encryption. So there are different concepts. They have different objectives. Sometimes you need only signing. You just need the other party to know that yes, I, TAC, actually sent this to you. Okay, you can count on it being me. But the actual content is not important enough to require encryption. Okay, I can give you an example, of why sometimes authentication is needed, but you don't need really encryption. Because I might be talking about something with my colleague face to face, and then at the end of that conversation, I said, okay, I'll send you an email to tell you yes or no, but I need some time to think about it. Okay. And then I just, send the email. Okay. And all it says is yes. So the content itself is worthless to other people, because yes to what, right? I mean, that's just that. There's no useful information other than the person who received it. But to the person who's receiving the email, the person might want to know for sure that I think I need to know whether it was actually tech, saying yes, because there might be some other people in the same conversation, and those people might want to spoof my email and say that yeah, tech says yes, when they know that tech is probably not going to say yes, in that situation. So there are certain cases where signing, or authentication is important, but you don't really need encryption. All right, both of these are typically based on key pair encryption. So key pair encryption is a very interesting mechanism because what you do is you use a mathematical way to generate two keys, okay, as a pair. Okay, so these two keys are related to each other because they make a pair. And the relationship is actually symmetric in the sense that if you lock something with one key, you can only unlock that something using the other key of the pair. In other words, using proper terms, if you use one key to encrypt something, you can only use the other key to decipher or to decrypt that thing. So it's a very interesting concept because we don't have something quite like that in real life. Because in real life, if you lock up something using a lock, it will be the same key that you use to lock up something, and it will be the same key that you use to unlock that something. So we don't have something quite like this in real world, where you have two keys. You use one key to lock, but that one key that you use to lock up the box cannot be used to unlock the box. It has to be the other key of the pair that you use to unlock the box. So is that concept okay in terms of the mechanism of key pair?
Yep.
Okay. So how do we use this interesting mechanism, which is basically entirely based on mathematics? Okay, in the case of signing and in the case of encryption. So in the case of signing, I'm just going to highlight the sentence here so that we have something to focus on. Okay, so this part here is about signing. I know it's a long sentence, so we'll go through one section at a time. So I'm gonna. Okay, so the first thing we need to understand is there's a concept called a digest. Okay, so we'll just highlight up to this portion here. So a digest is really just a fixed bit width pattern that can quote unquote ID the content of a much larger document. Okay, I'll give you an example. So let's just say that you use Microsoft Word and you finish typing, a document, so you end up with a docx, file. So the docx file itself can be rather large, right? Can be hundreds of kilobytes, okay? Depending on the content, it can be large. A digest is basically a fixed width bit pattern, and depending on which hashing mechanism, they're called hashing mechanisms. They're basically an algorithm using mathematics. So the hashing mechanism can generate a fixed width bit pattern that is quote unquote unique to that document. So your 300 kilobyte Microsoft Word file is going to have a quote unquote signature. Okay, it's going to have a digest of a particular width. Okay, number of bits. So let's call it 1024 bits. Okay, just for the sake of this conversation. What about the smaller file? Well, okay, you just typed up another smaller document. It is only 20K large. It also is going to have a 1024-bit digest because the mechanism itself is going to make a digest of 1024 bits. So what do we do? So a digest itself has no security feature in it because the computation to go from the 300K file down to the 1024-bit digest, that's public. Okay, that algorithm is published. There's no encryption of any kind. Anyone can take the same 300K Word file and compute and conclude with the same 1024-bit digest. So that part is not a security thing. It's really just a way to summarize, okay, the content, and you quote unquote uniquely identify the content of a particular file. So in this case, if you want to authenticate, then you take the digest and then you encrypt the digest, not the document itself, but just the digest. You encrypt it using the private key. So in this case, private key means, this is the key that you keep to yourself, the one that you do not let anyone have access to. That is called the private key. So do not lose your private key and do not let anyone have access to your private key, and hence the name private. Okay, so now you encrypt it using your private key, which means it cannot be unlocked using a private key. What can you use to unlock the digest in this case?
The public key.
The public key, the other key of the pair. Exactly. Okay. So now you send this file, or you can just put the file onto a shared resource like one. Is it OneNote? No. What
G
is the
Drive.
OneDrive?
G Drive, OneDrive.
Okay, so G Drive is Google, OneDrive is Microsoft. So you put it onto some place where everybody has access to. So somebody's gonna download that file and then suddenly come to a question of how do I know this is actually Kelly, who wrote this file. So what they do is now they download the digest, which is usually at the same place where the file is. So they download the digest, and then what they do is they have to use Kelly's public key, and it's called a public key because Kelly basically just put it on her LinkedIn list page and go like, this is my public key. If I ever send you something and you want to authenticate that I actually sent that something to you, this is the public key, because you would use the public key to decipher the digest, and you end up with the actual digest, right? So when you get the deciphered digest, okay, then you have to compare that to the actual digest that you can do by taking the same algorithm. Okay, you use the same algorithm to work on the 300K word file. So if the two digests match, then you can be certain, well, with a high certainty, you can be sure that whoever signed the document is the person that claims to be the owner of the file. Is that okay? Does everybody kind of sort of understand the concept?
I think I do.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Excellent. So it's still useful because you can really think about putting getting a certificate and publish your public key on LinkedIn. So this way, if you ever have a need to send something to other people and you want the other person to be very sure that it did come from you, they have a way to do that. So encryption is the other way around. Okay, to send material that may be exposed to a third party, then you want to encrypt it using the public key. No, I take it back. Let me rethink this. So you want to
You encrypt it with the private key.
no. You have to encrypt it using the public key of the recipient. Okay, I'll give you an example. Okay, so I want to send a file to Jennifer. Okay, and this file contains her grade and other things that are protected by, what is the name of that thing for students? Student privacy thing. You guys do not know. Okay, I can look it up. Student Privacy Act. FERPA, that's it. Okay, so by FERPA, I have to make sure that other than Jennifer, no one else can know the grade that Jennifer is getting out of this class. Then you might ask, but if you're sending that file to Jennifer directly, who else can see the document? I can give you a few examples. I use SureWest as my ISP. They get to see all the traffic coming out of my computer. They can see it. Okay, if I were to send the file as a plain text file, then SureWest would be able to see the content of the file as it is being transmitted from my computer onto the internet. And on the internet, okay, remember the internet is a connection between networks using the routers. So every single router actually can get to see the content of the file that I'm sending to Jennifer in plain text. So they can all see that Jennifer is getting a particular grade. Oh, this is problematic, right? Because I don't want anyone other than Jennifer to be able to see her grade. So what do I do? Well, the first thing I need to do is to ask Jennifer, if it is not already on her LinkedIn page, is to ask Jennifer, hey, do you have a certificate? If you do have a certificate, we'll talk about the concept of a certificate in just a little bit. If Jennifer has a certificate, I'll ask, can you send me your public key? Can you give me the certificate for the published portion, the part of the certificate that can be published? Send me your public key. So I get Jennifer's public key, and so can the rest of the world, okay? Because it's called the public key for a reason, right? So the rest of the world also has access to the public key, but in this case, I'm going to use the public key to encrypt Jennifer's grade before I transmit it, okay? Then you go like, but the rest of the world also has, Jennifer's public key. Shore West, has her public key. All the hops along the router, the route to Jennifer's computer also can see. They all have access to the public key. But it's not a problem, right? Because what what I can what I encrypt using the public key cannot be deciphered using the public key because you have to use the other key to decipher the encryption, right? So the other key is the private key. And who has the private key? It's called a private key
Jennifer.
I do.
because Jennifer is the only one who has the private key. And as a result, everybody can see the encrypted traffic. Everybody has access to Jennifer's public key, but no one can decipher the content except for Jennifer. Is that okay? Any questions?
No, that makes sense.
It's really kind of neat, right? This is a very, very neat concept of being able to lock something using a key, but whatever you lock using key A can only be unlocked using key B. Okay?
Is that why, like, at my work, like, our customers will tell us that they need a key and in order for them to get to something on our mainframe?
That
I-
may or may not be the same thing. It may not be the key of a key pair, because there are two different types of encryption. Key pair is one, but there's also a symmetric encryption mechanism where you can use the same key to lock and then you use the same key to unlock.
Okay.
Yeah, so in that sense, I cannot tell from what you said, whether it's a key pair thing, but I would suspect it is not a key pair thing. I think it's just a symmetric key.
Okay.
But I cannot be sure, just from what you described. All right, so that's kind of the, it's authentication and encryption in a nut case, okay, in a very small, concise, description. All right, so moving on. So back to Telnet and R login. Now we know these two terms from the discussion of Unix system services because that's how you sign in to Unix. Is to use Telnet and R login. But that's also done using ISPF, from within ISPF. So it's not actually just, Telnet and R logging in that case. But these two protocols, by default, are not encrypted. Okay, so on a system, just like this, I can use Telnet to connect to other systems. But no matter what I connect to, okay, let's try the power server. Okay. So the power server is a server on campus, where students can host their web content, for class purposes. But it's not going to make it, okay? It's not going to make it for two reasons. That port is blocked, okay? The firewall of Los Rios is blocking the port for Telnet. Why? Because Telnet is not encrypted. Okay, if I transmit my sign-in information, my username and my password, everybody along that route on the network can see all of that stuff in plain text. That is not very good, right? That's not secure at all. So the de facto standard on Unix and Linux systems for remote sign-in is SSH. So in this case, I use SSH, and I say SSH to power.arc.losrios.edu. And now when I type in my password and my username, that stuff is now encrypted. SSH stands for secure shell, by the way. It's not really just for remote access using a shell. SSH actually has a lot of interesting uses other than just signing in and remotely accessing the command line interface of a system. You can do a whole lot more than that, but that's way out of the scope of this class, so I'm not going to go there. Okay, HTTP is also not encrypted. So that means if you just use plain HTTP and a bank, allows you to do that, to sign in and do all the online banking, that's not very good, because that means, if someone is, someone working for your ISP can monitor your traffic, they can get your password, they can get your username, they can get all the traffic, okay? They can see how much money you have in each account and so on and so forth. That is not good, okay? So that's why we need secure HTTP. Secure HTTP is based on SSL, which stands for Secure Sockets Layer. I hope some of you still remember the term socket from the discussion of there are a few times we talked about the concept of a socket. We talked about sockets when we talked about I'm trying to remember which module, and the context was how to serialize. Okay, the serialization topic. We talked about sockets because that's one way for a process or a task or a address space to talk to another address space on a different machine. Okay, that's the first exposure to sockets. The second exposure to sockets was Unix file system, how the Unix file system sees everything as a file. So when a client computer is trying to make a connection to a server program, that connection is also known as a socket. So we got several exposures to the term socket. And I believe when we talked about TCP/IP on Monday, we also talked about the concept of a socket. It is a layer 3 concept. In other words, it's a transport level concept. So that a socket is also associated with a port. Okay, so that's kind of the important part, because later on we will talk about IPsec, IP security, and that is not a layer 3 concept, that's a layer 2 concept. But SSL is a layer 3 concept. So in other words, SSL can turn any insecure layer 3 traffic into a secured layer 3 traffic by using X509 certificates. Okay, so we'll get to certificates in just a little bit. Oh, right here. Okay, so right here we talk about ZOS already has two components. Okay, so these two are basically by default already installed in the system. One is SSL and one is IPsec. Both support client-server authentication using X509 certificates. So now I have to explain what a certificate is. Okay, so a certificate is, in some way, it is kind of like a collection of stuff. Okay, so there's one part of a certificate that says, that describes the entity who owns the certificate. So it can be a person, can be a company, can be a section in a company, can be a division in a company. So whatever the owner of the certificate is the thing that we want to be able to authenticate the identity of. Okay, so it can be a person. So in the case of a personal certificate, then someone can use the certificate and say, oh, okay, well, whoever sent this email has access to Lupe's certificate. Okay, it can be DMV itself, can be the entire California state government. So it all depends on the scope and what identity is needed for that authentication. So it has the identity, which describes the name. I believe it has the country code, the state code, and then there's also the local agency code. There's a whole bunch of stuff, text field that you can put into a certificate. So that's the first part. But a certificate also has a second part, which is the public key associated with that particular entity, the entity who owns the certificate. So that's the public key. But other than that, there's also a third part. The third part is a signature. Okay, it's a signature that is signed by a CA. A CA in this case is not California, but CA is an abbreviation of a certificate authority. There are only so many certificate authorities on the internet. Some are really well known, so when you go to an online merchant, they would usually say, "Oh, this site is secured by blah blah," right? That blah blah, typically is a certificate authority. So let me see if I can find one of those things. Amazon is too big. Amazon is probably its own certificate authority. So you have to go to something that's smaller. I cannot think of anything offhand right now. But in order to get a certificate, what you need to do is to go to a certificate authority, and then typically you have to pay for one. Okay, if it's for personal use, you're gonna have to pay for it. Now this I can look up is to find out, who are the certificate CA certificate authority.
I put one in chat.
Oh,
I put one in chat.
thank you. Let me go there.
I don't know if it's actually still active because it was hacked several years ago.
Yeah, well, these are high value targets for hacking.
They're actually unsure how many certificates were actually issued while it was hacked.
Okay, so you put it into the.
It's DigiNotar, DIGINOTAR.
Okay. Hold on a second here.
Goopy, are you a hacker?
I listen to a lot of hacking podcasts.
Well, those are all very interesting.
They mostly just tell you the stories behind stuff, but they don't literally say, "Oh yeah, you're gonna go and do run an SQL script on this, and this is how you do it." And they don't give you the technical; they just tell you the story of what happened.
Okay.
It's good to know too, because some of that stuff may actually affect just people like you and I.
Side note, if you ever think that you were possibly involved in a hack, like, you had a Target account when Target got hacked, there is a pretty good website called Have You Been Pwned?
Yeah.
And you can put your email address in, and it will go through and identify whether or not any information with that particular email address has been in a hack that's been publicized. So,
That is actually good to know.
Can you paste that in the chat?
Yep.
I think Firefox, no, maybe not Firefox. I think Firefox actually does warn you about your identity on particular websites that has a record of being hacked. I cannot remember which browser, but one of the browsers could do that.
DuckDuckGo does.
Hmm?
DuckDuckGo does. It doesn't allow any of your information to be received on the other side wherever you go. It keeps your confidentiality.
Oh, okay. Okay, so here's a table of the certificate authorities. DigiCert is one. GoDaddy is one. I think GoDaddy we all know. So these are certificate authorities. There we go. Thort is actually a big one too. THAWTE. So you might find their name on a lot of online merchants' website to be quote unquote secured by Thort. So with all of these, you can go there and actually buy, get a certificate. A certificate has a lifespan. I cannot remember the default period of time. I think it's like half a year to maybe a year. So when you pay money to get a certificate, it's only good for 6 months or so, and in 6 months' time, you're gonna have to pay again. and then to have your certificate renewed. Okay, so what does it mean? Okay, what does it mean when you go buy a certificate instead of what we call self-signing a certificate? I'll tell you why. Okay, so let's just say that I want to play pranks on Lupe. I'm just gonna pick on Lupe today. So I want to do some pranks on Lupe and pretend to be Lupe and talk to other people. Okay, so I would talk to other people pretending to be Lupe, and those people go like, "Nah, Lupe doesn't talk like that." I would go like, "Look, I got a certificate that says that I am actually Lupe." So that certificate that I show to other people is self-signed. Okay, so when people look at that certificate and go like, "Okay, let's see who signed this certificate over here," and they see, looks like it's signed by an individual called Tech All Young. That is not a certificate authority. Okay, I can ignore the rest of this conversation because you have failed to authenticate as Lupe. Okay, because if Lupe actually go to one of these places to get a certificate, the first thing these places would do is by some means, okay, and I would say by some means, they would try to identify and know the person who is applying for the certificate is indeed Lupe. So they would go through a particular process to establish the identity of the person who's requesting um, the certificate. And once that is established, then they will sign the certificate using the mechanism that I talked about. So each CA has a key pair. Okay, so they have a key pair, and they would use their own private key to sign the digest of the entire certificate and attach it to the end of the certificate. So now, when Lupe, shows other people his quote unquote certificate, those people can now look at the signature, okay, the signature of the certificate, and if the certificate says, oh, this is signed by DigitCert, which is one of these companies up here. DigitCert is the second place, ranked second. Then that person can go to DigitCert, get the public key of DigitCert, and use the public key of DigitCert to decipher the signature, and then that will get back to the digest, and now we can compare the deciphered digest against the actual digest of the certificate. If they match, then the person who's looking at Lupe's certificate can establish one thing with high certainty: is DigitCert did authenticate, did check the identity of Lupe before signing that certificate. Now, the certificate typically does not actually identify a person. It would actually just be identifying an email address in the cases of an individual. In the case of an organization, it'll be a URL. It'll be not URL. It'll be a website. So if I'm Wells Fargo Bank, okay, and I want to get my certificate, okay, then the one thing that I want to be authenticated is going to be my domain name. Okay, wellsfargo.com is going to be on the certificate, so that I can go to one of these agencies, one of these companies, and say, okay, I want you to give me a signed certificate so I can show the entire world that I am the proper owner of wellsfargo.com. So here's a question. How can these companies, how can a certificate authority establish that I am indeed the proper owner of the domain name of wellsfargo.com? So I'm going to get you guys to think about this a little bit. Okay, the answer is they will send an email to a email account at wellsfargo.com. And typically it is the webmaster at wellsfargo.com or something like that. Because if I do not own the domain name of Wells Fargo, then I would not be able to receive that email. In fact, they would go to the registry and find out, what is the actual email address of the webmaster or whoever owns the website, and they will send a email to that particular email address to make sure that whoever is applying for the certificate can get to that email. And once that is established, then one of these agencies will sign the certificate. So now, Wells Fargo Bank would get its certificate and show the entire world. I think it's probably a good idea to show you that too. wellsfargo.com. Okay, did I misspell it? Yep, it had a typo. Forgot
No,
the.
they wouldn't verify security on the site.
Huh?
They wouldn't verify security on the site. It was a joke.
There we go. All right, so this is Wells Fargo Bank, and what you cannot see is a lock because I didn't show I'm not showing my URL bar. So on the URL bar, there's a little lock symbol, and on the lock symbol, you can see connection secure, and then here is a link that can show the actual certificate. And this one is verified by DigitCert Inc., which we saw earlier. So, so that's what a certificate is. So in the case of, let's say, DMV or CDT, okay, how would a certificate be used? So in this case, there are two ends to the communication, right? So one is the agency itself. So when you try to sign in to a remote resource, you want to make sure that whatever you're connecting to is in fact the agency that you're trying to connect to. In fact, you want to make sure there's no man-in-the-middle attack, because an ISP is at a very unique position that it can potentially, if some employee of an ISP wants to do something bad, they can potentially launch what we call a man-in-the-middle attack. And I guess these days, to be politically correct, it will be person-in-the-middle attack. Okay. So the person-in-the-middle attack basically says, when I see the URL, wellsfargo.com, I'm gonna translate it to a different IP address. Okay, an IP address that I own. Okay. And as a result, I can now spoof, wellsfargo.com, the website, and I can pretend to let people sign in using their username and password, and then I can grab the actual username and password of people who are customers of Wells Fargo, and then I can use that credential to sign into wellsfargo.bank, and then do bad stuff, right? Well, with certificates, that cannot happen. Because with certificates, the other site that pretends to be wellsfargo.com, it might be able, to do some DNS trick, or if it's in the case of a man-in-the-middle attack, they can reroute the IP address to somebody else. But whoever is trying to pretend to be wellsfargo.com cannot have this signed certificate. Okay, let me show that again. So that person is going to be able to show a certificate, but it is not going to get the green stuff here. Okay, it's going to be red. Your browser would actually warn you and say, are you sure you want to proceed, because we cannot establish the authenticity of the certificate because it is not from one of the certificate authorities. So that's how a certificate is useful when you want to make sure whatever you're connecting to is in fact what you intend to connect to. So that means DMV, okay, if you want to work from home and you want to remotely sign into DMV, may have its own certificate so that it can establish the identity, the authenticity of DMV itself. But as an employee, you're gonna, from the perspective of DMV, they also want to make sure that, oh, you are in fact, employee blah 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 of DMV. So they might give you a certificate, okay, and they might get it signed also, so that you can now establish your identity as so and so, who is an employee of DMV. So in the strictest sense, okay, if you want to use SSL or IPsec, okay, and you want to maximize security, then both ends would use certificates, and both would be signed by a certificate authority. So this way we can establish the authenticity of whoever is making the connection, as well as the organization that this person is signing on to. Now, do you actually have to go to this length, to establish your identity and to make sure that you're actually connecting to CDT or actually connecting to Franchise Tax Board and so on? I do not know. Okay, I don't know, whether government agencies are, you know, they want security cranked up to that level. But in theory, both SSL and IPsec can do all of this stuff here. Does anyone know for sure, whether you have certificates that you have to manage at work?
We do.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's good, okay, because all that stuff is actually built in to ZOS. And all this stuff here is mostly on the Unix side of ZOS and not so much on the legacy side of ZOS. All right. Well, we are running out of time, but I do want to talk about this because I think it's kind of interesting. I think most of you have heard about two-factor authentication.
Yeah.
eBay uses that. Okay, every time you want to buy something from eBay and you're using your mobile, eBay would let you sign in using your username and password, but then it will also send a text to you and ask you what the number is on the text, just to make sure that you are, in fact, who you are. But I can think of other things, when you're in they can also make use of your location, because eBay really doesn't care, okay, whether I'm ordering something from home or I'm on the road, or whether I'm working at my workplace. It doesn't care, right? If I want to order something, eBay wants to maximize the opportunity for me to order something because they make money in the process. But if you're working for um, a government agency where you actually have very sensitive information and data, then you might want to also know where that person is, right? Where the employee is. So you can basically say, okay, here's the address of tag. Okay, so we can say within, 50 yards of this address is okay. Okay, this is where tax office is on campus at ARC. Okay, and then within 200 yards of that, we'll say it is okay too. So now we have three-factor authentication because we are using the username and password. That's the first one. And every time I sign in, they want to send me a text the same time, so that I would also enter the number, usually a number on in the text message, to make sure that yes, so at least whoever is signing in owns the cell phone of that number. That's basically what that second factor is establishing. But we can also use a third factor because ARC or Los Rios can have a little contract with T-Mobile, okay? Because they can identify by my phone number, they know who's my mobile carrier. So they can have a contract with T-Mobile and go like, um, can T-Mobile help us triangulate and figure out the location of a mobile device while we are also sending an SMS message to that mobile device. So T-Mobile says, well, if we're making money, sure, we can, we can give you that information. So now Los Rios can also at the same time use a third factor to make sure that I am at a place where I'm supposed to be when I access the Los Rios resources. I don't think it has been implemented yet, but I can see that definitely as a potential. Does anyone know whether any government agency is using location, like GPS location, as one factor of authentication?
Not that I'm
Not that
aware of.
I know of, yeah.
That might have some privacy issues, don't you think?
Yeah.
Well, what if I'm take my laptop and go work at my mom's house for the day?
then they won't let you do it. And I can legitimately see why they may not want to allow you to do that, because if your laptop is stolen, then the person who stole your computer may not actually be after the worth of the hardware, but they might actually be after the ability of your laptop to connect to work. So I
We're
can
franchise
definitely
tax.
see, huh? What?
I was gonna say we're franchise tax board. We know everything about you already.
Loopy, I've been pawned.
Yeah, I have to.
Okay.
All right. Um, so we'll
Me too.
continue this discussion on Monday.
Okay.
Alrighty. You guys have a good
Thank,
weekend.
Right.
Thank you.
have
You
you
too.
heard anything about a replacement teacher?
Yes. So
For the next class?
apparently, Mark Heavener
Yay.
is going to help teach the at least one, if not both, of the
Aw.
CISC330 classes, and
So
he
they
is
won't
going.
be delayed?
Hmm?
So they won't be pushed out like we were thinking?
Yeah,
They're
it
going to
won't
be
be
on
pushed
track?
out. It won't be
Okay.
rushed. Because he already knows about the plan, and as far as I know, he is going to teach the class with someone else as a clinical consultant. because
Okay.
because Mark is more of a developer than a system operator, so he knows something, but not enough. He doesn't feel comfortable being the only person with the knowledge, so he's also going to get someone else to help him with um, operation specific topics. And knowing Mark, okay, I can only say this because of how he taught the other cohort. He is very responsible. Okay, if he says he's going to do something, he's going to do that something and 150%. So I think you
He
guys
the
are.
one that taught our mainframe, you guys, or was that his brother?
That's his brother.
Oh, okay. So I don't know Mark. Okay.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
which
But that's good.
it wasn't it Havner that taught the networking stuff?
The
That was
That's
I get
Brett.
that's Brett Havner. Okay.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I got it
Gotcha.
confused. Okay.
Yeah, but Mark Heavener, from what I know of him and what I have seen, the way he taught his classes, he is very, very responsible. So that means you guys
Good.
will get work to do, okay? But at the same time, you will also get the proper content to make sure that you learn what you're supposed to in these classes.
Cool.
Okay.
I want to learn more about SMPE because that's what we really need to learn
Okay,
when
SMP is
we
on
get
the
the
in the
work.
last one, which is 333,
Okay.
and he is also
Okay.
very receptive to to having you guys to tell him what you actually use at work, so that he can make the class as customized as possible to emphasize on certain topics and possibly not talk as much on other topics. So he's very open to all of these things. He'll be a good fit. I think he'll be a very good fit for the other two classes.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so
Well,
I'm
I have
just the guy who's keeping the chair, the seat warm.
Well, thank you for doing it.
Thank you,
thank
Tag.
All
you.
right, you guys have a good weekend. Thank you.
All
Wait,
right.
I have a question
Yeah, go ahead.
about the final or exam. How we're gonna be great? I don't know. I'm worried.
um, well, you guys have full attendance for sure. Okay, so I'm not gonna. So I know you guys are here. Um, I don't have time yet to think about the assessment. Um, and we got a week to go because next Wednesday is our last class. So I think I will probably get something figured out by Monday, and I'm gonna give you guys most likely a multiple choice test that is not exactly timed. It is timed in the sense of you have to get it done within a few days, but it's not going to be within like 2 hours. Okay, so you'll get plenty of time. It will I will let you guys use any internet access, just not talking to each other, but you can Google, you can go back to my modules, you can go to IBM, documents and whatnot. You can go to the footnote links, of the documents that I have written. So you can look up things and you can read stuff over a few days to answer the questions. But I'm gonna use. I
And
think
that's
that's
good
what
and
I'll
fair
do.
because that's what we'll have to do in our real jobs too. I mean,
Exactly. Yeah.
we're not expected to memorize all of this, but we're gonna be learning. That teaches us how to do the research and dig deep, and so
Exactly.
I think that's fair.
Okay. Yeah. Most of the questions I think is going to be mostly knowledge type of question and not problem solving kind of questions, because I think that's relevant to the content of this class. In my other classes, the programming classes, they're all like IQ tests, problem solving. Everything looks like Sudoku.
Oh,
Okay.
okay.
All right, so
Thank
I
Well,
think
thank
that
you.
gives you
you. Have
some
a good
idea of
weekend.
what we're gonna do for assessment, so that you guys can get a grade.
Okay.
Okay.
Alrighty, I'll talk to
Night.
you
Thank
guys
you.
you.
next
Good night,
Monday.
everybody.
Bye.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, good
Bye
night.
bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.